Coming up on New Day at Arirang, one final push before his term is up. President Moon Jae-in urges the 18 member states of the East Asia Summit to support Seoul's efforts to resume talks with North Korea and end the regime's nuclear program. The top diplomats of South Korea and Russia agreed to closely cooperate on all issues related to North Korea as Seoul's peace drive continues on all fronts. Plus, South Korea on course to confirm more than 2,000 new cases of COVID-19 on Thursday. Could this impact the government's plans to start the transition to living with COVID? Hello and welcome to New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. on Thursday, October 28th here in Seoul, South Korea. We are inching ever closer to the weekend. I'm Mark Broom.
And I'm Kim Mo-gan. It's great to have you with us. Over the next hour, we're going to be taking a look at the big news stories of the day and get some expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world.
We are going to start where we have been doing most of this week on the coronavirus situation here in South Korea. The country is seeing an uptick, unfortunately, in cases ahead of the easing of restrictions set to kick in from next week. And potentially making matters worse, Korea's notoriously cold winter is steadily closing in.
And for more on this and other COVID-19 related updates, joining us live in the studio is our reporter Choi Min-jung. Good morning, Min-jung.
Good morning.
Min-jung, let's start with the daily figures for today. What are we expecting?
Well, the officials are forecasting today's dailies tally to go above 2,000. From midnight to 9 p.m. on Wednesday, South Korea confirmed more than 1,900 new cases. This is more than 70 cases compared to the same period the previous day. Authorities also revealed South Korea's total variant cases for last week totaled 3,300. All but one were the Delta variant. If we just look at the domestically transmitted variants, 100% were Delta. On top of this, South Korea saw almost 20,000 breakthrough infections. This is equal to 0.074% of fully vaccinated people. Most were in their 30s and those who had the Janssen vaccine.
Now, we hear that South Korea's health authorities are on extra alert for numerous reasons, especially this week. Tell us more about that.
Right, there are growing concerns of a potential uptick later this week. It's almost November, so we are approaching winter, which health experts say causes the virus to spread much more easier than it can in warmer weather. On top of that, there's the upcoming flu season, so authorities are not letting their guard slip. Let's take a listen.
COVID-19 and influenza are respiratory viral diseases with similar symptoms. When a patient with a fever visits the hospital during the winter, it's more difficult to differentiate the viruses. We ask the public to actively participate by getting vaccinated against influenza as well.
And there's a third factor, Halloween. It's time when young people go out to mingle with friends and let their hair down.
Well, given the current circumstances, it seems like it's all the more important to up our vaccination rate. How is that going?
Right, so the government is going to announce plans on expanding booster shots this afternoon. They will likely address plans on giving booster shots to those who receive the Janssen vaccine. As I touched upon before, they currently are the most vulnerable group to breakthrough infections. They're also expected to talk about whether Janssen and Moderna vaccines will be added as booster vaccines. Right now, only Pfizer's is being used as the booster shot for medical workers and seniors above 60 who received their last shot more than 6 months ago. The country is also pressing ahead with vaccinating teenagers. For teenagers 16 to 17, more than 62% have reserved shots, and 28% have received their first doses. For those between 12 and 15, just under a quarter have made reservations. As of now, the country is not reviewing vaccinations for kids under 12.
Right, and we must say that for minors under the age of 18, they must get parental consent before they reserve a vaccine, of course. So that's vaccinations covered. Let's talk a bit more about the various COVID-19 treatments that we hear are about to hit the market here in South Korea.
Right, so the government will soon sign a contract to purchase oral COVID-19 treatments enough to cover 400,000 people. This is 10 times more than what was originally planned. The government has been negotiating with overseas pharmaceutical companies with the aim of bringing in the oral treatments early next year. The details will likely be announced on Friday. And currently, Merck is waiting for approval for the oral antiviral treatment molnupiravir from regulators in the US and Europe. The company has also decided to share the license for the treatment with a UN-backed nonprofit organization to allow companies to manufacture generic versions. The licensing agreement is expected to expand access in more than 100 countries.
Well, that's a rare sign of generosity from a pharmaceutical giant. So hats off to Merck for doing that. Wonderful reporting as always. Min Jung, you'll be back with Mo-kyun for our new newscast. So we will see you then. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. Now, vaccination passports are the topic of fierce debate in many countries that have or about to introduce them due to the COVID-19 pandemic. South Korea is preparing to introduce them as well. But with mass protests against vaccine passports happening in cities across Europe, the US, and Australia, are we likely to see a similar reaction here? Well, critics say at best, vaccine passports are a waste of time and at worst, a gross infringement of civil liberties. Advocates would counter that by saying the rights of others should also be respected to not potentially have a virus inflicted on them by an unvaccinated carrier.
Yeah, so to dig deeper into this topic that has sparked controversy around the world, we are very happy to be joined live by Professor Michael Toole, Associate Principal Research Fellow at the Burnet Institute in Melbourne, Australia. Professor, Australia has seen its fair share of protests regarding these vaccine passports. Looking at the data available to us right now, are these passports productive, neutral, or counterproductive in preventing the transmission of COVID-19? And speaking for yourself personally, are you for or against them?
Good morning. Well, I think, the situation that we're in at the moment is that vaccination rates are rising to high levels, at least in high-income countries. And yet in many of those countries, the virus is still circulating. Now, if I could speak to my own city, Melbourne, we are approaching 80% of the eligible population fully vaccinated, but we're reporting almost 2,000 cases a day. So the virus is across the city. Secondly, our city has been in lockdown longer than any other city in the world, 263 days. And people really want to get out and enjoy new freedoms. But if they are mingling with the unvaccinated, they have a 30 times higher chance of being infected from an unvaccinated person than a vaccinated person. So I think it's in the interests of the majority of the population that we have these vaccination passports. I have one on my smartphone and it works very well. It's linked to the QR code check-in, so the staff can immediately see if I'm fully vaccinated. So
I think we're seeing...
If you wouldn't mind repeating what you just said there, it cut off for the last 20 seconds or so. You were saying yes. What you thought of them personally.
Personally, I'm in favour of it because I am fully vaxxed, and like everyone else who's fully vaccinated, I would like to enjoy perhaps a beer at a pub or a meal in a restaurant without sitting next to someone who is not vaccinated.
Now, apologies for the technical disconnection. Well, continuing on, Professor, critics of vaccine passports say that insisting people be vaccinated in exchange for keeping their jobs or simply going to store steps are steps way over the line and essentially makes them second-class citizens. Taking the possible medical pros and cons out of the equation, where do you stand on the ethics of vaccine passports?
Sorry, there's some interference coming Um, I, I think there are precedents for doing this. For example, in just about every country in the world, we have to wear a seatbelt when we drive or wear a helmet when we ride a motorbike. We're not allowed to smoke indoors. And the reason we do that is one, for our own protection in the case of a seatbelt, but also to reduce the pressures on our health system from people being injured in car accidents. As for smoking, I don't think that means smokers are second-class citizens, but it's important that the staff and other customers in an indoor setting are protected from the cigarette smoke. So I think there's plenty of precedents in public health, and this is another one. Keep in mind, if you go to some countries in the world, you have to have proof that you're vaccinated against yellow fever. So I think this is part of the principle of protecting most of the population.
Now, back towards the early part of this pandemic in April 2020, I checked it for myself. The World Health Organization issued this scientific brief. At that time, they recommended that the use of vaccine passports not be used. And if we go back even just a few months, the notion of things like vaccine mandates, even booster shots, used to be shrugged off by many as mere conspiracy theories. That was then, this is now. What exactly has changed over the course of the past few months?
Well, I think we understand more about how the virus spreads. Secondly, we have this Delta variant, which is dominating the world. It spreads more easily and can quickly overcome health systems, particularly in poorer countries. So I don't know what the WHO's current position is, but I think in terms of travel, international travel, that they would be supportive of making sure when people cross international borders, they are fully vaccinated, and therefore they're preventing the introduction or the reintroduction of the virus into countries that may not be able to cope. Now, here in Australia, we have a state-based government system. Some states with very few COVID cases have closed their interstate borders to states like the one where I live. And I think it's in their interest too to insist on a vaccine passport if people from my state, where the virus is spreading comprehensively, to keep the virus out of those other states. So I think as for boosters, when vaccines were first rolled out, we did not know how long the immunity would last. That was impossible to tell from the clinical trials. Now, from countries that started vaccinating early, like Israel, the UK, and the US, we know that after 5 or 6 months, immunity wanes against infection. But it's still very good at keeping you out of hospital. So the reason for a booster is not so much to protect the individual, because they're still protected from severe illness, but to keep people from spreading the virus. And keep in mind, if a vaccinated person is infected, they have a lot of virus in their throat. So they can still spread it to the unvaccinated, for example, children. So I think we'll see boosters rolling out pretty soon. In Australia, we will start next month.
Okay, and finally, Professor, there are also privacy issues regarding vaccine passports, which are almost exclusively in a digital format. They're installed on smartphones, meaning an individual's movements can be tracked round the clock. Now, on top of that, there are also concerns about personal data being stolen or leaked. What, if anything, could be done to prevent such overreach or data breaches?
In Australia, most of the states have passed very strict laws preventing the sharing of information from QR codes, which of course are now linked to immunisation status. And that includes the police. The police are not allowed to use that data in the investigation of a crime. So I think it's up to each jurisdiction to make sure there are very good laws in place to prevent breaches of privacy. The other thing, of course, is the technology. And the technology has to be sure say. And I think in the case of Australia, there have not been yet any cases of breaches of privacy because of these strict laws and the very good technology being used.
Wonderful. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but we really appreciate your insights on this very complex debate. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, in other news, President Moon Jae-in says a formal end to the Korean War is an important starting point to achieving peace on the Korean Peninsula, and adding it'll also lead to global peace. The comments were made at the annual East Asia Summit.
During that session, US President Joe Biden also expressed concerns over threats to the international order, referring to recent actions taken by China. Bae-Eun-ji with the details.
South Korea's President Moon Jae-in on Wednesday took part in the East Asia Summit involving 18 nations, including leaders of ASEAN members, South Korea, Japan, China, the US, Russia, Australia, India, and New Zealand, where they discussed regional and international challenges. During the session held virtually, President Moon called for continued support for a formal end to the Korean War, which he has suggested in his UN address.
제가 지난 유엔 총회에서 제안한 종전선언은 대화의 문을 열고 한반도와 아시아, 나아가 세계 평화로 가는 중요한 출발점이 될 것입니다.
Moon also says South Korea will play a role in global vaccine production to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic and will do its best to ensure a fair and swift supply of vaccines. During Wednesday's session, U.S. President Joe Biden expressed concerns over threats about international rules-based order. He said the U.S. is deeply concerned by China's coercive and proactive actions across the Taiwan Strait, a waterway linking Taiwan and the mainland. He also added that he will speak out for human rights in Xinjiang and Tibet, and the rights of the people of Hong Kong. Meanwhile, according to Kyodo News, Japan's new Prime Minister Fumio Kishida told reporters that during the EAS session, he conveyed Japan's firm stance on maritime security in the South and East China Seas to leaders of other countries. This comes as China claims sovereignty over almost the entire South China Sea. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang said the South China Sea is, quote, our common home, and that upholding freedom of navigation in the South China Sea is in everyone's interest. Bae-Eun-ji, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in leaves for Europe in the coming hours for the G20 summit in Rome and the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. His trip also includes a stop at the Vatican, where he will meet with Pope Francis to discuss the Korean peace process. Our senior Blue House correspondent Kim Min-ji reports.
President Moon Jae-in will embark on a 9-day tour of Europe on Thursday, which will take him to Italy, the UK, and Hungary. His first official stop on the itinerary is on Friday at the Vatican, where Moon will meet with Pope Francis to discuss ways to boost peace on the Korean Peninsula. This will be Moon's second meeting with the Pope. His first was in October 2018. Likely on the table for discussion will be a potential visit to North Korea by the Pope, who has expressed willingness to go if there is an official invitation from the regime. Attention will be on whether the meeting will also be able to reignite the stalled peace process. President Moon will then attend the G20 summit over the weekend. It's the first time that the multilateral event will be held in person since the start of the pandemic. On the agenda are climate change, COVID-19, and post-pandemic global recovery. On the sidelines, Moon is also expected to meet with U.S. President Joe Biden, although the timing and format has not been decided. From November 1st to 2nd, President Moon will be in Glasgow for the UN Climate Change Conference. There, Moon will give a keynote speech in which he is expected to unveil South Korea's new carbon emissions reduction target. Attention is on whether he will meet with Japan's new Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, who has expressed his intent to attend the COP26 summit. The final leg of Moon's tour will take him to Hungary for a 3-day state visit. Moon will first pay his respects at a memorial in Budapest to remember the 25 South Koreans who died in a boat accident on the Danube River in 2019. On November 3rd, Moon will have separate talks with the Hungarian president and prime minister, followed by a business forum with members of the so-called Visegrad 4 countries, which also includes Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Poland. The next day, the president will attend the South Korea Visegrad summit to discuss ways to expand cooperation with the second-largest market in Europe. The Blue House expects a series of multilateral diplomatic events to serve as an opportunity to drum up support for the Korean Peninsula peace process and highlight South Korea's raised global status and its role in bridging advanced and developing nations in the post-pandemic era. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
The top diplomats of South Korea and Russia have been discussing North Korea and ways to achieve the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. During a stay in Moscow, South Korea's foreign minister also invited Russian President Vladimir Putin to come to Seoul once the pandemic is under control. Yoon Jung-min tells us more.
The two foreign ministers from South Korea and Russia have agreed on the need to resume talks with North Korea in order to continue the Korean Peninsula peace process. At a press conference after their meeting in Moscow on Wednesday, Seoul's foreign minister once again asked for Russia's constructive role for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, calling Moscow an important partner.
We have agreed to closely communicate and cooperate at various levels for the restart of the Korean Peninsula peace process as soon as possible. We have exchanged opinions on various cooperation measures for the early resumption of talks with the North.
The Russian foreign minister said they had discussed the situation on the peninsula in detail, stressing the need for the resumption of dialogue by all related parties, possibly meaning the two Koreas, the US, China, Russia, and Japan.
We believe that a diplomatic solution should be possible and that talks should be resumed by all parties concerned. We need to ensure that no factors intervene that will lead to increased tensions.
A high-level official reportedly said Russian officials have also shown support for the Korean government's end-of-war declaration proposal. As for Seoul-Moscow ties, they have agreed to further expand relations in trade and the economy and continue to cooperate in 9 key sectors, including energy, infrastructure, and shipbuilding. They have also agreed to expand cooperation in overcoming the COVID-19 pandemic. Chung added they have agreed to work toward a visit to South Korea by Russian President Vladimir Putin as soon as the pandemic situation gets under control. Chung and Lavrov also attended a cultural event on Wednesday commemorating 30 years of diplomatic ties between the two countries. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
The U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee has passed a bill to counter North Korea's censorship. It also encourages sanctions on those who enable such a repressive information environment, both inside and outside the regime. The bill, called the Otto Warmbier North Korea Censorship and Surveillance Act, is named after the American university student who was detained by the North in 2016. He died in June 2017, just 6 days after being released. If enacted, the bill requires the US president to devise and submit to Congress a strategy on how to combat North Korea's repression of information. Iran has agreed to resume nuclear talks with Western powers and China before the end of November, with the exact date to be revealed by next week. This is according to the country's chief nuclear negotiator in a tweet put out on Wednesday. And this is coming after he met his European counterpart in Brussels on the same day. The negotiations aim to resurrect the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which was essentially scrapped after the former Trump administration withdrew the US from it in 2018. Under the old deal, Iran was supposed to limit its nuclear program in exchange for the removal of sanctions. And now we cross the baton over to our Ocean for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we connect with experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. From mobile phones and laptops to electric cars and military aircraft, semiconductors enable almost every industrial, commercial and military system. That's why many governments around the world now deem them essential to the economic and national security of their nations. Amid growing competition between countries and an ongoing global chip shortage, it seems production and supply chains are becoming heavily entrenched with geopolitical complexities. And this week, we saw South Korean and American trade officials meet and agree to hold regular discussions on semiconductor issues. To discuss the flurry of developments in the global rush for chip supremacy, we turn to Troy Stangerone, Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute of America. We're also joined by Paul Frioli, Research Fellow for Geopolitics and Strategy and also Editor of Strategic Comments at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Very warm welcome to you both. And well, to start things off with you, Troy. US firm Global Foundries, now it's a chip maker, it's going public on Thursday. And while it's not the biggest semiconductor company in the world or even in the US, it does seem that the occasion is quite significant as Washington aims to reduce its dependence on Asian chip makers. What do you see as the prospects for this company?
Well, Global Foundries dates back to when ADM decided to spin off its own fab business. And over time, the company has acquired some other businesses as well to become what Global Foundries is today. But up to 2018, it was seeing declining revenues. And despite the pandemic, it has also still failed to make a profit. So while this firm is looking to add capacity and could be a player in the future, specifically in the automotive industry, which is a key area for the Biden administration, given the semiconductor shortage in automotives. Right now, it's still a small player, and it's going to have to take and prove that it can become profitable if it's going to be a significant player, both in the United States to help relieve the semiconductor shortage and in the long run.
And of course, there are various semiconductor players in the US market right now. And well, Paul, South Korea's chip makers, Samsung and SK Hynix, as well as other major global chip makers, they've been asked to share sensitive information with the US government regarding their supply chains, with the threat of enforcing the Defense Production Act should they fail to cooperate. How should we really interpret this?
Yes, well, as you say, in September, the U.S. Commerce Department, headed by former Rhode Island Governor Gina Raimondo, asked the companies in Taiwan and South Korea which make semiconductor chips to fill out questionnaires on a voluntary basis by November 8th, seeking information related to the ongoing chip shortage and their supply chains. Now, we should probably view this development first through the lens of U.S. domestic politics and more distantly through the lenses of the U.S. government attempting to enact an industrial policy where it helps U.S. companies to the detriment of other companies, such as those in Taiwan or in South Korea. So this government has taken office. It took office in January of this year, and it was immediately greeted with the prospect of a supply shortage because this has been a multi-layered crisis in which the pandemic has sort of hit different areas of the world at within different timeframes. Causing both a supply disruption and sort of expectations of demand that sort of have created the crisis in terms of a shortage that may last through 2023. So the administration was attempting to head off a more severe crisis and shortage, say around the Christmas holidays when people will be wanting to purchase electronic goods and automobiles. So it's attempting to do everything it can in order to learn more about the supply chains, international supply chains, where the weak points are and where those might be patched over. The U.S. has struggled historically to enact industrial policies because there's not a good way of communicating between private industry and the U.S. government in many respects. It still struggles with that, and so I think that's sort of the less distant prospect that the U.S. is, say, trying to help one company or another, although that's not to say that Samsung and other companies should not be cautious.
Mm-hmm. And well, a number of observers, they are saying that the US is requesting such confidential information for the benefit of its domestic companies such as Intel. Troy, what would your thoughts be on this?
So I think when we look at the situation, it really is being driven by the situation in the US domestic economy right now. You're seeing shortages that are leading to production shutdowns in the automotive industry. The consumer electronics industry is facing semiconductor shortages. And what the Biden administration is trying to do is right now, and Paul's right, there is a political element to this in that the president's approval ratings are down. He needs to get inflation under control. He needs to get the supply chain situation under control. And part of this has to do with the semiconductor industry. And so when we look at this, It's really about how can you take and keep auto production moving? How can you ensure that consumer electronics move? How can you ensure that all of these things come together? And so when we look at the situation, it is for the benefit of U.S. companies, largely for those who are producing. I think in the case of Intel and maybe some other U.S. Producers, having looked through the call for information, it seems like given where SK Hynix and Samsung produce and what Intel does, that it's unlikely to take and be of benefit to Intel. And I also wouldn't expect the current administration, while the Trump administration might have been different, to take and give that information to Intel. So I think that's perhaps an overblown concern. But I do think, in the long run, this can also be a benefit to Samsung and SK Hynix. One of the specific questions in the request is, where are you facing supply blockages in your supply chains? And so if there are areas where the US government can take and help Samsung or SK Hynix to take and eliminate those blockages and then improve production, that's to the benefit of both Samsung and SK Hynix, but also potentially to Kia and Hyundai, who've had to shut their factories down due to a shortage of semiconductors as well.
And well, it's not just the US, but it's a lot of governments around the world that are now coming up with plans to build up national competence in semiconductor technologies and manufacturing. Now, Paul, would you say that the barriers to entry are quite high?
Yes, they do remain quite high. And my organization, the IISS, released its annual strategic survey yesterday, and it points out that Taiwan still accounts for 55% of global production for the very top end of semiconductors, and South Korea accounts for almost all of the remainder. There's a fabrication of semiconductors that are in such high demand. It hasn't really gone far beyond those two countries because it takes so long to do so. The production is highly complex. It relies on hundreds of inputs from different sources, including chemicals, gases, wafers, and it takes a really long time to build up that capacity. Now, the US and China in particular are seeking to raise their domestic capacity to fabricate these products domestically, but there's probably, realistically, a decade or more lead time until there's a significant market impact. I mean, Samsung is just on the verge of announcing a $17 billion commitment to build a factory or a fab plant in Texas, but again, it will take time for these investments to bear fruit.
And Troy, the lead players in global chip production right now are Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, TSMC, and South Korea's Samsung Electronics. And together they control more than 70% of the semiconductor manufacturing market. Do you think they can retain their competitiveness in the market with these emerging players? Or do you think the industrial landscape will inevitably have to change as the US and China, their companies, they're going to compete more fiercely, backed by all this government money?
So I think there's a couple issues at play here. One is that even setting aside their total percent of semiconductor production around the world, Samsung and TSMC account for 100% of the production of chips below 10 nanometers or less. And so all of the most advanced chips are chips that only they can produce. So that right there is a significant advantage, and that's going to be something that's going to take time to be a challenge for other companies to catch up on. Two, when we look at this situation right now, there is a significant advantage that both companies have. One, in the case of TSMC, they are in essence a contract manufacturer. They are not designing and producing their own chips. So as long as they maintain their technological edge, I see no reason why TSMC will not remain a dominant company. Now, if other companies are able to take and develop more advanced technology and they don't invest in their R&D, that could be a problem for TSMC. Samsung is in a slightly different position. It's trying to build out its own fabrication business, but it also designs and produces its own chips, many of which end up in, for example, Samsung phones, but also in phones by Apple and other companies as well. And so it's similar in the sense of that as long as Samsung takes and continues to reinvest its profits into R&D, maintains that technological edge, I think it's going to be very challenging for other companies to catch up. Right now, they're essentially in the memory sector, three dominant firms, Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. And it's hard to really see anyone really breaking into that rank of the top three, anytime in the next perhaps decade or so.
And well, Paul, South Korean chip businesses, they have been going through quite a rough patch. They were hurt quite badly when Japan took trade action on 3 essential ingredients that are exported to chip makers here in South Korea. Do you think Samsung and SK Hynix were able to turn things around and really turn that crisis into an opportunity? Or do you think they remain fairly disadvantaged? I mean, especially with Japan recently having announced that it's set to invest massively in TSMC.
Yeah, so I recently published an article in Strategic Comments that points out that, yeah, as you say, Japan is the dominant global producer of these 3 materials. So there's fluorinated polyamide, photoresist, and hydrogen fluoride. And in July 2019, Tokyo tightened controls on the export of these materials, supposedly due to concerns over lax oversight and handling. But given the importance of these materials to South Korea's semiconductor industry, Seoul has interpreted the move as a pretty aggressive and calibrated weaponization of economic leverage to achieve kind of a political goal. Now, this occurred amid a larger dispute between the 2 countries over historical matters, and it was made possible in a larger sense by the fact that South Korean trade with Japan and vice versa has declined so sharply since the 1980s. It's actually striking now how little South Korea and Japan trade with each other, despite their geographic proximity, and China has effectively taken Japan's place as sort of South Korea's top trade partner. So the ties, economic ties that have bound those 2 countries are weakening. And as a result, I think the semiconductor industries and the high technology industries in both countries those ties will also fade alongside those larger economic ties.
And Troy, South Korea is aiming to build the world's biggest semiconductor supply chain complex by the year 2030. And while it is home to 2 sizable chip makers, Samsung and SK Hynix, do you think it has what it takes to build a globally leading complex?
Well, first off, the fact that the South Korean government is going to invest $450 billion over 10 years is a significant way to take and make this happen. If we look at the United States, where there's a significant push to take and try and reshore production and to improve R&D here, the U.S. government is looking at investing $52 billion. So you have a significant difference in terms of the commitments of the 2 governments in taking and developing the semiconductor industry. Add to that Samsung and SK Hynix are the number 1 and number 2 firms in the memory chip business, which is the most profitable side of the semiconductor sector. You have significant resources to take and build out production, to build out research and development, to try to move into other areas. And so one of the key is going to be, will Samsung and SK Hynix be able to move into new areas? Will they be able, Samsung already produces some processing chips, but will it be able to expand its production there and move into a greater market of that? But as we move into the future, artificial intelligence chips are going to be one of the key areas. And so will South Korea be able to take and really build out its research and development and production capacity for these types of chips, which will be key to the future? And at the same time, though, I think there's going to be one pushback, and that's the one we already see now, which is this issue about basically supply chain security. Now, I don't think we are going to move to a world or situations where all chips for the United States will be produced in the United States, but I do think you're going to see key partners for Samsung and SK Hynix want to see some diversity in the location of production to ensure that in the event of a natural disaster or something, that we don't see production completely taken and shut down for extended period of times. Now, this can happen as we saw this past year in the United States, so it's not just a question of something that could happen in South Korea. The Samsung plant in Austin was down for about 5 weeks. It accounts for 5% of global production of semiconductors. So you can have this situation in the United States, but I think this desire to ensure that we can avoid these supply chain issues in the future, and that if there's a disruption in one area, production can continue or be made up for in another, is going to be a key going forward. And so I think that is going to be the pull factor on South Korea's desire to take and build up even more semiconductor production domestically.
And well, speaking of supply chain security, Paul, amid this geopolitical rivalry that we're seeing between the United States and China, there's been a growing emphasis on supply chain cooperation, particularly for semiconductors between like-minded liberal democracies. And well, at the same time, it seems that they're competing with one another. We've got South Korea, Taiwan, the US, and even the European Union coming up with its own semiconductor plans. What do you think the semiconductor competition and cooperation is going to look like? Do you think we're going to see some form of chip nationalism here?
Yes, I think a strong dose of nationalism here is probably inevitable, and in some sense has already been injected into the industry. I mean, if you look at China, for example, China is the second largest consumer globally after the U.S. of the types of electronic devices that use semiconductor chips, but it does not manufacture the vast majority of those chips that are used domestically. So its need for semiconductors is a rare point of vulnerability for it in the international trade landscape. Usually, it's the case that other countries are relying on exports from China, but in this case, it's the reverse. So this is why the Trump administration, followed by Biden, has attempted to use export controls to limit the amount of semiconductors flowing into China in key industries, and particularly towards its telecommunications firm Huawei. Beijing's response has been to vow, to achieve self-sufficiency in semiconductors by 2030, promising the massive amounts of investments necessary to do so. That's just an example. I mean, you see a smaller scale competition because when there is scarcity in the global marketplace, even allies and friends and partners will compete over the same scarce goods, bidding up prices, sometimes creating uncertainty in the markets over what the prices will be now and in the future.
That was Troy Stangerin, Senior Director and Fellow at Korea Economic Institute of America, and Paul Fraley, Research Fellow for Geopolitics and Strategy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thanks very much.
Ahead of the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, South Korea has confirmed its new targets for slashing its greenhouse gas emissions. The new plans are even more ambitious than before, a 40% cut in less than 10 years. Seo Eun-kyung reports.
South Korea has confirmed its carbon emissions reduction target ahead of the United Nations Climate Change Conference. The cabinet has approved the government's new goal of cutting the country's carbon emissions by 40% by 2030 as part of efforts to be carbon neutral by 2050. It's a plan even more ambitious than the initial 2030 target of 26.3%. Those costs are from 2018 levels, the peak year of South Korea's gas emissions, and the baseline year for setting the country's emissions reduction targets. The plan outlines the reduction goals for each carbon-intensive industrial sector. For the energy supply sector, the government aims to lower emissions by 44.4%. This will be achieved by cutting the use of coal by 20% from 2018 levels and expanding the use of renewable energy by 24%. In the transportation sector, the country is aiming for a 37.8% emissions cut and looks to get at least 4.5 million zero-emission vehicles on the roads. When it comes to the construction sector, the government aims to reduce the emissions by 32.8%, mainly through making new buildings more energy efficient. And for other industries, the target is 14.5%. The cabinet also approved scenarios to realize the goal of going carbon neutral by 2050. They all aim at stopping the use of coal and pushing up the use of renewable energy. President Moon plans to introduce the country's new vision at the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, Scotland in early November. Seo Eun-kyung, Arirang News.
South Korea has been seeing runaway house prices in the past few years despite the government's efforts to cool down the market. The finance minister, though, says the rate of growth has been slowing down in recent months. Ji-young has this report.
South Korea's housing market has been heating up in the past couple of years and has only climbed higher in the pandemic. House prices are still rising, but the situation seems to have changed a little in recent months. At a government meeting on the property market on Wednesday, Finance Minister Hong Nam-ki said that the rate of increase in Seoul and the capital region has been slowing.
With measures implemented to expand housing supply, an increase in interest rates and controls on household debt, the rise in house prices has slowed down recently. Also, the sentiment in the property market is showing changes.
According to the data released by the Finance Ministry, apartment unit prices in Seoul and the surrounding capital region since September have increased, but not at the same pace as before. Hong also said that as South Korea is at an important period, he'll go all out to stabilize the soaring prices. But a realtor in Seoul says the increase in house prices in some parts of Seoul is not as fast because there are fewer homes on the market.
In some regions, the prices are slowing down and being adjusted, but this is because the number of people trying to sell or buy has fallen sharply due to government regulations and controls on mortgage loans.
An expert says the direction of the housing market in the future could depend on the outcome of next year's presidential election.
The ruling party will try to maintain the current policies and will expand supply through public housing units, and the opposition party is likely to try to boost supply by easing regulations for sellers.
He added that the direction that property prices will go depends largely on the amount of increase in housing supply. With the goal of increasing housing supply and helping people get on the property ladder, the government is to announce its plan next month for public housing unit pre-subscriptions. 엄지영, Arirang News.
2 months have now passed since South Korea evacuated nearly 400 Afghans out of their home country after the Taliban retook control. South Korea's Justice Ministry has been tasked with ensuring their transition to this new life they find themselves in is as smooth and as peaceful as possible. Our Han Song-woo travelled down south to check out how they're settling in.
From Jincheongun County, Chungcheongbuk-do Province to way down south by the sea, Afghans of special merit to South Korea have relocated to a new home. Here at the Korea Coast Guard Academy in Yeosu, Jeollanam-do Province, all 391 Afghans will be spending the next 4 months adjusting to Korean society and culture under the Justice Ministry's assimilation program. Awaiting their arrival on Wednesday were the police and a joyful crowd of locals, holding welcome banners and filled with pride that their city would be the Afghans' next host.
Not a single one of us objected the Afghans' relocation to Yeosu. We welcome them with open arms and hope they settle well over the next 4 months.
The Afghans, 79 families in total, will be resuming the education they were receiving in Jincheon, but in more depth. Officials said a joint government support group will be launched in November to assist them in all facets of Korean life, ranging from law and order and public education to employment and health insurance.
The project will allow us to meet their needs in a more efficient and organized manner. Our ultimate goal is to enable the Afghans and their families to lead an economic life on their own and be able to integrate into Korean society.
The South Korean government evacuated the Afghans from Taliban rule in a rescue operation codenamed Miracle back in late August, classifying them as not refugees but special contributors. According to the Justice Ministry, the Afghans will soon be able to upgrade their F1 visa to an F2, which will grant them long-term stay and employment opportunities, en route to standing on their own 2 feet. Han Song-woo, Arirang News, Yeosu.
Switching gears now, the Seoul Tourism Organization is hosting an event for food lovers from Friday. It's called Taste of Seoul and runs through next Wednesday. There are events like cooking classes, screenings of movies about food, and Seoul City bus tours to some popular foodie destinations. However, due to COVID-19, events will take place in small groups, some online. For details, visit the website tasteofseoul.visitseoul.net. It also has a list of Seoul's 100 must-visit restaurants and bars.
let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission is investigating Facebook documents which indicate the social media giant may have violated its 2019 settlement with the regulatory agency over privacy concerns. According to the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday, the FTC have started looking at international Facebook research that identified all ill effects of the company's product and whether it violated the 2019 settlement agreement. A Facebook spokesperson said the company is more than willing to answer the regulators' questions, adding it will continue to cooperate with government inquiries. In 2019, Facebook agreed to pay a record $5 billion to the FTC to settle charges of privacy violations over the company's handling of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where regulators found the company deceived its users about privacy protections while allowing third parties to harvest their data. The COVID-19 pandemic in the U.S. generated massive sales in home appliances and indoor gym equipment due to extensive social distancing schemes. However, it also led to an increase in sales of cigarettes in the country. For the first time in 20 years, the U.S. reported an increase in cigarette sales in 2020, up 0.4% on year. While the increase is slight, it's a reversal of a long-running downward trend in sales that the country has been seeing. U.S. adult smoking rates have been on a decline since 2000 and now stand at around 14%. While the Federal Trade Commission didn't detail why sales increased in 2020, experts say the rising trend is similar to consumer behavior ushered in by the pandemic. They added that increased isolation, stress, and uncertainty caused the perfect storm for substance use disorders, such as smoking. In addition to an increase in cigarette sales, retail alcohol sales also shot up 14% in 2020. Coca-Cola CEO James Quincy said Wednesday that he expects the popular beverage to see sporadic shortages on grocery shelves through 2022. Just like other food and beverage companies, the soft drink giant is dealing with issues with supply chain and higher commodity costs, leading to shortages. Quincy added that while shortages may persist through next year, the situation will improve and shortages will significantly decrease over time. He also cited some of the issues the company is facing, including labor shortages, a spike in gas prices in Europe, as well as a fire at a plastic plant in Brazil. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Good morning. It's shaping up to be a picture-perfect autumn day across Korea as long as you're aware of wide gaps in ratings. In fact, it's a chillier morning than yesterday, but milder afternoon, so do dress accordingly on your way out. And thankfully, air quality will be normal to good nationwide under sunny skies, so it's going to be a great day for an afternoon stroll. Low temperatures in inland regions are below 5 degrees Celsius. Daegwallyeong is beginning the day below zero again, while Gyeongsang-Pukto province is covered with thick fog this morning, so please drive with care. Afternoon readings will be slightly higher than yesterday. Seoul going up to 20 degrees Celsius this afternoon. Daegu, Gwangju will be similar to yesterday, topping out at 21 degrees. And it seems like we're going to end October on a promising note under mostly sunny skies, while autumn colors are hitting their peak in the capital area. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that's the end of this Thursday edition of New Day at Arirang. Thank you for spending the past hour with us. We appreciate your viewership. I'm Kim Mo-kyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. I'll be back in just over an hour from now at 10 a.m. Korea time with our next newscast. Both Mo-kyan and I will be back here the same time on Friday for our last New Day at Arirang of the week. Wherever you're watching us around the world, thanks for tuning in. Goodbye.